Yeah. Thank you all so very much for coming to this presentation, this plenary address by Peter Stansky, How the World Turns, Two Examples, Virginia Woolf and the Dreadnought Hoax, The Life of Julian Bell. Peter Stansky is the Francis and Charles Field Professor of History Emeritus at Stanford University. He was educated at Yale, King's College, Cambridge, Bloomsbury College, and Harvard. Author of 20 books and editor of many more, he has written extensively on William Morris, George Orwell, and the Bloomsbury Group, and on other topics involving modern Britain. On Bloomsbury, besides various articles and reviews, he has authored or co-authored 3 books. On or about December 1910, Human Character Change, Early Bloomsbury and Its Intimate World, Julian Bell, From Bloomsbury to the Spanish Civil War, and Leonard Woolf, Bloomsbury Socialist. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you very much, Amy, and congratulations on I hope on the splendid conference. I hope I'm loud enough and can be heard. I apologize for the rather harlequin look on my face, but it's because I'm overlooking the San Francisco Bay, and the light comes in. And I'm particularly pleased, well, of course, that this is a virtual conference, because I would have loved to come to Texas. And in fact, I'm half Texan in that my mother was raised in Austin, and even technically, I think I'm a Texas ex, because between high school and college, I spent the summer in Austin and took a course on drama at the UT summer school, and of course, from the fundraisers, that makes me I get email. And also, I have cousins in Austin, including Sarah Goodfriend, who's quite a bit of a political activist, and I don't think she's, she's not particularly into Virginia Woolf, but I think she's very much in the spirit of Virginia Woolf. So I'm very pleased to be in Texas, virtually. Well, I'm very honored to be asked to give a plenary talk. It will be, if you will forgive me, rather personal and casual as I sink into my anecdotage. Also, I fear I belong to the pre-PowerPoint age, let alone sharing screen age, and hence I won't be using images as perhaps I should. I suspect that most, if not all of those listening and here, are familiar with the appropriate images. And in any case, the advantage of this being virtual is that I can hold up for you the 2 important images connected with my topics, though they probably won't be very clearly seen. What I'm planning to briefly discuss now is how the passage of time changes how we view the past. Before doing so, I would like just to mention the recent discussion among some Woolfians, which probably I hope quite a few have noticed, about Daisy in Mrs. Dalloway and whether she might be Eurasian. This is brought forth, which I don't know if all of you are aware of this, this has brought forth the fascinating information based upon the Virginia Woolf cousin, William Dalrymple, who's a historian of India, that Virginia Woolf herself had Bengali ancestry. Pretty remote, but still, it turns out that her maternal great-grandmother's grandmother was Bengali. How aware of this was she? If so, what did it mean to her? I rather suspect that she was barely aware of it, if at all, and made no comments about it. But I haven't carefully gone through the diaries and letters, and I would be fascinated to hear if anyone has discovered anything along those lines. I think this is a powerful example how our present interests legitimately shape what we find in the past. But this is not what I will be discussing today. Rather, I will briefly consider 2 other questions based on my own experiences, but each in different ways. First, I propose to look at the Dreadnought hoax, about which I wrote a chapter in on and about December 1910, Early Bloomsbury and Its Intimate World, published as long ago as 1996. Then, more briefly, the two versions of a book I co-authored with William Abrams, a biography of Julian Bell. The first, Journey to the Frontier, a dual biography of him and John Cornford, was published in 1966, and then in 2012, an updated and expanded versions of just the Julian Bell half, entitled Julian Bell, From Bloomsbury to the Spanish Civil War. I just told one version of the Dreadnought hoax story, but two versions of the latter. What I would like to consider today is how time and history have changed how we view the Dreadnought episode, and then quite differently, how the passage of time has changed, perhaps not drastically, the Julian Bell story. That is, how the passage of time and or new concerns and questions legitimately shape how we view and understand the past, how we view, in this case, Virginia Woolf and Julian Bell. And of course, Gretchen talked very interestingly about the Dreadnought hoax yesterday, and also, rather symbolically, the sort of latter, I don't know if you call it a version, dreadlock hoax, which of course the use of the term dreadlock is significant. The Dreadnought hoax took place on February 7th, 1910. It was perhaps first written up in Adrian Stevens' pamphlet, The Dreadnought Hoax, published by the Hogarth Press in 1936. As you all know, the famous incident was when a group, pretending to be 4 Abyssinian aristocrats and their 2 British escorts, managed to be entertained officially on the Dreadnought, the most famous British warship at the time. Excuse me. In Adrian's account, he claimed that whatever skills he might lack, he was nevertheless completely accurate. That, in fact, was quite untrue, as in fact he made an error that is frequently, amazingly frequently repeated in accounts of the hoax, that it was the Emperor of Abyssinia who visited the Dreadnought. In fact, the pretense was that it was an Abyssinian prince in England to visit Eton, where his sons might enroll. Adrian, Virginia's brother, was the crucial link who triggered Virginia's involvement. He was a close friend and contemporary at Cambridge of Horace de Vere Cole, of whom there's a biography, the wealthy young man who was the organizer of the hoax. Some years before, in 1905, Horace de Vere Cole had arranged a visit of the alleged Sultan of Zanzibar's uncle to Cambridge, where he was hosted by the mayor. Adrian, characteristically, in his account, as a preface in the pamphlet he wrote, mistakenly promoted him to the Sultan himself. Horace, perhaps surprisingly, was more cautious. Cole, with Adrian's cooperation, now organized this new hoax. What I didn't know when I wrote my version was that I don't think I discussed that a possible origin of this hoax was that Cole knew officers on another battleship that had a tradition of playing jokes on the officers of the Dreadnought in return for the jokes that they played on them. Apparently, this gave Cole the idea of playing a trick in support of his friends involving the Dreadnought, and Cole was addicted to arranging such elaborate practical jokes. But it was purely by chance that, in fact, that Virginia took part in it. At the last moment, 2 days before, 2 of the participants dropped out, and Adrian prevailed upon his sister and Duncan Grant to join the group. It's unclear whether Virginia and Adrian knew when they agreed, but they knew before they went that their cousin, William Fisher, their first cousin, William Fisher, was chief staff officer on the Dreadnought. Though they weren't close, he might recognize them even if disguised. But it probably added to the excitement of the adventure. Vanessa was very upset that Virginia was participating, considering her rather fragile mental health. What were the motivations of Cole, the architect of the hoax? No doubt to tweak authority. He promised that he wouldn't go public about it, but he couldn't resist doing so after the hoax had been successfully completed. The group had been royally entertained on the Dreadnought. At the lower level, the mayor of Cambridge, much to his ultimate fury, had been manipulated to entertain a false uncle of the Sultan. The British Navy was a much grander institution. Ultimately, the hoax would lead to questions in Parliament. Why was the uncle of the Sultan of Zanzibar, an Abyssinian prince, chosen to be the created aristocratic figures? As of course, as I shall return to, in these very race-conscious days, these are central questions. They were grand figures, a sultan's uncle and a prince, yet they were black. The Abyssinians had some years before defeated the Italians in battle, a significant event that gave Europeans pause. I don't believe the hoaxes were seen by their creators as demeaning blacks, but of course this is a matter for discussion. There were undoubtedly racist undertones. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the famous photograph that actually, I'm afraid it won't be very visible, just notional, but actually Gretchen showed a better picture of it. And this is of the 4 Abyssinians and the 2 British. And Virginia, if you saw it much larger, she's in blackface and she's bearded. And I think even if you looked at it very, very closely, she wouldn't be recognizable. I mean, she in fact does look very, very, very masculine. The first iteration of interpretation of the hoax, that it was making fun of authority, teasing the establishment at its very height. It received extensive and amused coverage in the press, with no attention paid to its possibly more serious political implications as being against military preparations. It was treated as a great and successful joke. I don't think there was anything particularly political in the thinking of Horace Cole or his sidekick Adrian. As Quentin Bell, in his biography of Virginia, wrote about the hoax, the object of their excursion was to hoodwink the British Navy, to penetrate its security, and to enjoy a conducted tour of the flagship of the home fleet, the most formidable, the most modern, and the most secret man of war then afloat, HMS Dreadnought. The visit went very smoothly, and the group was, as I say, royally entertained appropriately on the ship. When the hoax became known, there was a great deal of attention to it in the press, and as I say, in government offices, particularly not surprisingly the Admiralty, as well as questions in Parliament. Fisher, the cousin, William Fisher, was particularly outraged and organized in retaliation a non-painful subsequent ceremonial taps of a whip of Horace Cole and Duncan Grant. There was a famous episode where Duncan went in his carpet slippers from breakfast, accompanied by Fisher and his friends, and got the taps in the park. But then they offered to drive him home, but he took the underground. Those close to Virginia worried about its mental effects on her, but as far as one knows, she was fine. As I say, the contemporary interpretation of the hoax was an extraordinary as an extraordinarily elaborate practical joke, created at great expense, considerable expense, by Horace Cole, with very grand costumes, jewelry, and false beards. Virginia herself supported this interpretation in an interview she gave. She said, "I entered into it because I thought I would like the fun." In a later story, the same day in the Mirror, there was a strongly racist remark about the pleasure felt by the naval rivals about the hoax that I didn't, and again it shows what one picks up, how one finds different things when you're looking for different things. I didn't pick up on at the time. A nice example, as I say, of changes in interest affects what we select to use from our sources. Quote, "Especially pleased are the men at the idea of the Dreadnought crew being turned out to salute black princes." And there's a wonderful sort of tension or paradox. Black princes. The hoax received a huge coverage in the press. When I wrote about it, I wrote at some length on this coverage, not looked at to any extent before, as well as the extensive exchange of memos by government officials about what to do. Actually, several of them went to see Reginald McKenna, who was then, or was summoned to see Reginald McKenna, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, and he sort of, said, naughty boys, and didn't take it any further. And the Admiralty and the government people, even though there were questions in Parliament, reached the eventual conclusion that doing nothing was the best solution, the most likely to lead to the hoax be forgotten as quickly as possible. And it turned out the hoax was not illegal. The only thing that was illegal was a friend of theirs had sent a telegram at the last minute to the Dreadnought saying the princes are coming, entertain them, in the name of Harding, who was the permanent secretary or whatever of the Foreign Office, and that was a forgery, and that was the only thing that they could actually sue about. So in fact, there was nothing that could be done, and then the decision was taken, let's not make a fuss, and we hope it will be forgotten as soon as possible. This was an important part of what I could add to what had been written about the hoax before, and hence put it in a wider context. The public world of the press and the more private world of the politicians, but including the very public world of what was said and questions that were asked about it in the House of Commons. Reviewing what I wrote about the hoax in conclusion 26 years ago is somewhat different from what I remembered. But I think my subtext was that I saw the hoax in retrospect as a protest against militarism, the arms and naval race between Britain and Germany that played such a crucial role in bringing about the First World War. As you know, those of you the famous, the building of the Dreadnought there was a famous slogan, "We want 8, i.e. Dreadnoughts, and we won't wait," and which was incredibly popular and put incredible pressure on the Liberal government to build up the military and the Navy. And the concluding paragraph of my chapter in the book about this was, I'll quote it if I may. "The Dreadnought and its sister ships, and their rivals being built in Germany and elsewhere, were important factors in the coming of war. They represented public military values. The question of how many warships will be built was still a matter of debate. The Liberals, despite being the party of peace, retrenchment, and reform, their slogan, felt they had no choice but to give in to the demands of the time, for better or worse, that prepared Britain for war. The hoax's implications of the foolishness of the military had no effect in sidetracking the juggernaut of the First World War that was to come. It was also intriguing that 4 of the 6 were disguised as Africans, and then one of the 6, Virginia herself, was cross-dressing. Although The Sex Change of Orlando, published 18 years later, was a kind of love letter involving Vita Sackville West, it is possible that the robes worn on the Dreadnought that day had something to do with the central hinge of that dazzling fantasy. The change, he was a woman, took place while Orlando was ambassador to Turkey. The flowing robes that the princes wore were rather androgynous, but the beards were certainly masculine. For Cole, and probably for the others as well, carrying off a grand hoax was the dominant motive, I think. Yet the episode does suggest that in their irreverent fashion, Virginia, Duncan Grant, Adrian, and friends were also striking a blow on February 7th, minor as it might be, for private values and against war. But recently, excuse me, how the Dreadnought, I'm sorry, but recently how the Dreadnought hoax is approached has experienced, I think, a dramatic change. It is, as I say, a striking example of how contemporary concerns quite legitimately lead us to look at the past in different and rewarding ways. In the past, Virginia cross-dressing has been paid some attention to, and that she was also in blackface has not been ignored. Now, in this era of Black Lives Matter, there is a much greater concern and engagement with issues of racism. We feel compelled to come to terms with the significance of Virginia, as well as 4 other members of the group, being in blackface. True, 3 other members. True, they were depicting aristocrats, but, and in a way, it might be a part of perhaps a matter of concern in Virginia Woolf's studies. We are a society devoted to Virginia Woolf, committed to her genius as a writer. Yet we are made, I think, somewhat uneasy by her snobism, charmingly discussed herself in her essay, Am I a Snob? We are made somewhat more easy by her anti-Semitism, summed up in her remark that she was about to marry a penniless Jew. She did undoubtedly have that rather casual anti-Semitism of her class. It is hard to evaluate how deep it was, but even if superficial, it cannot be totally dismissed. I believe that some members of the society that she think that she ultimately considered herself Jewish because of her marriage, but I think that is extremely unlikely. She was on the Gestapo blacklist to be rounded up after invasion, possibly as a Jew or married to a Jew, but more likely as an anti-fascist writer. She and Leonard, as you all know, did plan to commit suicide if invasion had taken place. And a lot of people thought it was extremely likely to happen in the fall of 1940. But the question of her racism has recently come to the fore, triggered, as I say, by our present concerns. As we all know, and there's been some discussion of it, I think, in the conference, questions have been raised about her bust in Tavistock Square in this era of the removal of monuments that are seen as celebrating racists. The Camden Council is considering the question of the future of the bust. The society was involved at the time of its dedication, that is, the English Society, and maybe the American as well, because I think the dedication of it, I think, was in the 2004 conference, with the first conference that this organization had in England, but I may be wrong. And it is the masterpiece of its maker, Stephen Tomlin, of whom there's been a recent biography. Of course, it also marks her grave at Monk's house, and I have by my desk, a photograph of the bust at Monk's house, the Tomlin bust. There's even talk that something might need to be done to protect it from anti-racist vandals. Was she a racist? I fear the answer without question is yes. Was putting on blackface in the hoax a sign of her active racism? And of course the great issue is how deep was her racism. I rather doubt that, as the princes could hardly have been more richly decked out. There was, I believe, little thought on the part of the perpetrators of making fun of the black princes. As Marielle and I have talked from time to time, class, rank, and position are very important to the English. And I believe in this case, they would trump race. There is a famous, perhaps apocryphal story about Edward VII, when asked about receiving the King of Hawaii, in which his courtiers suggested perhaps he should be ignored as a black man. Edward replied that as a king, he should be shown all due deference. If not a king, he should be ignored as a black man. I haven't done an examination for this purpose of Virginia's letters about her racism, and I haven't looked at her, going through her letters and diaries. Perhaps others have, but I'd be surprised if a certain number of racist remarks wouldn't be ignored. I remember her being rather nasty about some Ceylonese visiting Leonard. The great question is how seriously her racism should be taken. Or to put it in another way, does it change our conception of Virginia in significant and important ways? I fear I'm not about to answer that question here. Obviously, this question shouldn't be and mustn't be ignored, and it should be evaluated. Nobody is perfect, but presumably we'd like our heroes to be so. But it is not to be. There's probably a racist aspect of her and three others putting on blackface for the hoax. But in doing so, they were also making fun of the British state and not, I believe, making fun or demeaning black people. Quite legitimately, our present concerns lead us to look at aspects of the past comparatively neglected before, and in the process enrich our understanding of the past. I don't think, and we can talk about this later, of course, I don't think racism played a major role in the hoax, but being in blackface was dramatic. That has led us to examine an aspect of Virginia Woolf that has not received much attention before. We obviously deplore her racism, even if it might be comparatively mild. Our object is to study and evaluate Virginia Woolf in all her aspects. So I hope I've demonstrated, or I've tried to demonstrate, how the present changes how we view the past and can lead us to enrich our understanding of it. I won't venture into the more significant question, what does it all mean? That I will leave to colleagues, and perhaps in the Q&A some ideas will be advanced. The Julian Bell story is a very different one. And it's based, there's Julian. This is the dust jacket of the second Julian. And if you will forgive me, emboldened by Amy putting notices about books, I've just discovered that the Stanford, this is published by the Stanford University Press, and if I may make a very short, you'll forgive me, sales pitch. The Stanford University Press has put on sale up till August 1st, 1,000 titles from its backlist at 80% off. And the Julian Bell book is on that. Its list price it's overpriced. Its list price is $50. but it's available. If you go to the Stanford University Press website, you'll be directed to it will tell you that it's available for 80% off. So, in fact, this book is available if you wish to acquire it for $10. Anyway, there's Julian. Julian Bell, the middle Julian, because I know Julian Bell the younger, the art critic and painter, came up in some discussions. And as people tend to forget, in fact, Toby's, the English proclivity to use a second name as the name that people are called. Toby was actually Julian Toby Bell, and Julian the poet was named in his memory, and Julian Bell, the current critic and painter, Quentin's son, is named in memory of his uncle Julian the poet. But as I say, Mike, again, I'm how time changes, but the Julian Bell story is very different. What I don't discuss, and perhaps I should have, in some of the perceptive remarks that Mark Hussey made in the previous session about biofiction, but I think he was the one participant who was a biographer rather than a biofiction writer. The two things that a biographer does is tells the story, but then the more important thing is what does it mean, and that's what the biographer's point of view. And when he mentioned that, I realized that even though, as I'll say, there's such a separation between these two publications about Julian Bell, I didn't change my point of view, and I now feel perhaps a little guilty. Maybe I should have thought about that more seriously. But changes happen, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the approach that Billy Abrams and I took to Julian Bell didn't change, which perhaps, considering that there were almost 40 years or more between the two publications, perhaps it was a failure on my part that I didn't have a new view of him. As with the Virginia Woolf tale is an example of how the passage of time changes how one views, although I say in this case that didn't actually happen, and writes about the past. Well, it happened to an extent because of new information. But here it is a more mundane story than how new attitudes and materials can change what one knows and thinks about a particular subject. It is a more personal story, how the depiction of Julian Bell changed in the two versions of his life. My awareness of him started as long ago, God help us, as 1952, when I was an undergraduate, and as of now has culminated in 2012. In my senior year at Yale, I wrote a senior essay on 4 Englishmen and their participation in the Spanish Civil War: George Orwell, Stephen Spender, John Cornford, and Julian Bell. Of course, I can't exactly remember how this topic came about. I had had an interest in the Spanish Civil War for some time, and at Yale I became increasingly interested in British history, particularly in those areas where culture, literature, politics, and society met, fueled by a visit to England in the summer of 1950, particularly marked by a visit to King's College, Cambridge. This may well have been a factor in my increasing interest of Bloomsbury, and this was the Bloomsbury boom was just beginning. There was, Virginia Woolf. I think it's frequently forgotten. I mean, Virginia Woolf was not an unknown figure, but she was regarded, I think, as a major novelist. But there was nothing like the present situation. I can't remember more specifically how I came across Julian. My main source was the memoir book edited by Quentin Bell in 1938, his books of poetry, and some periodical publications available in the Yale and New York Public Library. After Yale, I did a second BA in history at King's College, Julian's College, but didn't do work on Julian himself. By an extraordinary coincidence, the sort of serendipity I enjoy, my main supervisor at King's was Christopher Morris, whose wife Helen said that she knew some of the Bloomsbury people, and she read my senior essay, which I brought with me. She sweetly praised it, but said nothing further. It would be some time later that I discovered that for 2 years, while a Girton College undergraduate, she had been Julian's lover, and that they had almost gotten married. Fast forward to the early 1960s. William Abrams and I had written an article together, a byproduct of my dissertation research on who should be a poet laureate after Tennyson's death. We then considered what we might write next, and I showed him my senior essay. We embarked on a trade book about the Four Men and the Spanish Civil War. Journey to the Frontier ended up being just about Julian Bell and John Cornford. This was based on what manuscript material we could find, as well as printed sources and interviews with those who had known him, many, of course, who were still alive, including a memorable interview with Leonard Woolf that I said something about previously in the Leonard Woolf session. Our two most important sources of material, both verbal and their guidance to others we might speak to, and what archival sources were then available, were brothers of the subjects, Quentin Bell and Christopher Cornford. According to the conventions of the time, we had to be discreet about Julian's love life. At this point, we knew that Helen Suter Morris had been Julian's lover, but she couldn't be in the book by name, so she is there as A. Although I had become personal friends with the Morrises, somehow it had become off limits to talk about Julian. I now regret that we never did, though it might have been extraordinarily awkward. Following the convention of being discreet, we labeled his subsequent lovers alphabetically. B was Lettice Ramsay, the photographer, and of course the widow of Frank Ramsay, and she might well have been willing to be mentioned. She lent us her letters from Julian, as well as talking to us about him. He moved on to other lovers. After failing to secure a fellowship at Cambridge, publishing poetry, being somewhat active in politics, and establishing a small literary reputation, but clearly not part of the With-It Auden group, although he published with them in new signatures, Julian secured in 1936 an English professorship at Wuhan, now University. Wuhan, of course, unfortunately, now very well known because of the pandemic. There he launched into a passionate affair with the wife of his dean, Shu Ha, a fairly well-known feminist writer. Here, too, the conventions of the time determined how the affair was to be treated. Julian's letters to his mother from China formed a major part of the memoir book, and the course of the affair was fully recounted there. But, as in the memoir, in our book, his lover is known as K, and there also is in the memoir book another figure, the wife of the dean, who was presented as a separate figure, but in fact, as we knew but couldn't say, they were the same person, a protection for the still living person. As an indication of how times have changed, there is now a somewhat pornographic novel about their relationship called K. And of course, Patricia Lawrence has written about it very much in her terrific book about Bloomsbury in China. Quite a few years later, I mean, the first one's 1966, the second version 2012, I published a second version of The Life of Julian. In this case, it's a somewhat different story, was not primarily because of the passage of time had changed how we look at the past. The passage of time had meant that much more material had become available, most particularly in the Bloomsbury archives at King's College. Also with deaths, and with the vast expansion of what could be written about in terms of people's sexual lives, one could be much more explicit. The impetus for me, the impetus for me to write a new version of the biography came about at the meeting of this society, the first in England in 2004, to celebrate the centenary of the beginning of Bloomsbury, when the siblings moved to Bloomsbury. Part of that event was a visit to King's, and a reception on the King's lawn on a beautiful summer evening with a small display of copies of material from the King's archive, including Vanessa's notes on Julian after his death, and a letter to him from Duncan Grant about his going to Spain. These made me realize how much more material about him was likely to be available 40 years on. I decided to embark, with Olivia Bell's approval, on an expanded version of, but not authorized, on an expanded version of the life of Julian. The lovers' true names could be revealed, as well as the true story of the Chinese affair, as well as the use of other new material. The most challenging in that regard was how to handle the affair with Helen Suter, particularly as her daughter was a good friend of mine. When Helen died, Anne, the daughter, consulted with her husband, the distinguished historian John Jadikis, and me about what to do with Julian's love letters to her mother. We said that if Helen had wanted them destroyed, she would have either done so herself or instructed that it be done. So eventually they were given to the King's archive and were most useful for my new version. The more awkward issue was how to use recently published Virginia Woolf material in which she wrote that both she and Vanessa disliked Helen and with Quentin were anxious that a marriage, which as I say almost happened, they had taken out a marriage license, not take place. I did not quote all the negative remarks Virginia made, but I felt I had to include some. I don't think Anne, the daughter, was pleased. She never acknowledged receiving a copy of the book from me, nor made any comment about it. The most dramatic new information about Julian's personal life had already been revealed in Miranda Carter's 2001 biography of Anthony Blunt. It turned out that Julian's first serious love affair was with Anthony Blunt, a fellow apostle, from the spring of his first year at King's in 1928 until the following autumn. Of course, as you all know, Blunt went on to be famous as a very prominent art historian, keeper of the Queen's pictures, and a leading Soviet spy. The affair was also present in the 2003 series, The Cambridge Spies, where Julian, I hasten to say, was not a Cambridge spy. There's a charming scene, obviously made up, because the scriptwriter obviously wasn't there, where Julian and Blunt are about to go to bed together for the first time, and Julian says, "Shall I take off my socks? They are given to me by my Aunt Virginia." And Blunt replies, "Pray don't." The Bells knew, I'm sure, though I don't know this is a fact, but I'm virtually certain, and I hesitate to use the word that Mark quite rightly condemns, that the Bells must have known about the affairs, about the affair, as I'm sure some others we interviewed, notably Eddie Playfair, years before, but they chose not to tell us about it. We were working on Journey pre-Wolfenden, when homosexuality was still illegal. Blunt was still alive, but not yet disgraced. It would have been very difficult to write about this, but I suspect that Quentin and Olivia Bell felt in that English way, extremely helpful as they were, that there were some things they did not think it was appropriate to tell us, even if the story couldn't be in the book. And as we couldn't use the information, although perhaps we could have without naming Blunt, perhaps it's just as well we didn't know. Julian had written to his, and of course, it's fully discussed in the new version. Julian had written to his mother, and as you know, in a way, Julian's most important relationship was with his mother, and he told her everything. He had written to his mother about the affair, saying that in the letter, as we say in Cambridge, Anthony and I are sleeping together, although it's not clear why he thought that was a term unique to Cambridge. He also requested that Virginia not be told about it, not that he thought she would be shocked, But according to him, and with some justification, it would be the same as publishing the news in the Times. In the case of the two versions of the biography of Julian Bell, the influence of the passage of time is less dramatic, I think, than in the Virginia Woolf case, but is more based on how we look at the past in different ways as our concerns change. But both are examples how things change as the world turns, as time passes. We are now allowed to write much more frankly about sexual matters. There is, of course, the passing on of those who knew the subjects, and hence could no longer be interviewed. But that also frequently meant that after their deaths, their papers were more likely to become available. New material obviously enriches our understanding of the past. In any case, I hope I provided some evidence making it clear how the passage of time changes how we see the past. Some might find it disconcerting that the past is continually changing. As William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It is not even past. But I believe how our understanding, knowledge, and depiction of the past help change it, and depiction of the past, how it changes, helps make it exciting to be a scholar in the humanities and no doubt other fields. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was wonderful. Thank you. So we can take questions, comments.
Oh, I see. I haven't looked at the chat. I don't know.
Yes, there's been quite a lively chat. People sharing the Ariel shared the books and people talking about some of the things you were discussing.
I guess there's some issue about Eurasian. Was Daisy seen as Anglo-Indian? Of course, what's confusing is Anglo-Indian is used in two ways. I mean, it's used either from English or British people who are in India, or people of mixed race. But I think the distant grandmother. Virginia's great-grandmother, the mother of the Paddle sisters, was French. But apparently her grandmother, and of course the French had a presence in India, apparently her grandmother is the person that's said was a Bengali. But I think she was a Bengali, not a Franco-Indian.
Peter, I read, I think a lot of us have read Bloomsbury Pie, the very interesting overview and not overview, very detailed book about the changing attitudes towards Bloomsbury, especially in England. And when you went to King's College and when you were there in the 50s, what was your sense of how people thought about Bloomsbury at that time?
Well, actually, when I applied, I said I was interested in Bloomsbury, and of course, part of the beginning of the Bloomsbury boom, or great interest in Bloomsbury, was rather perhaps paradoxically started by one of the factors was Noel Lannon's study of Leslie Stephen, which was the unusual point he made with the continuities from the Clapham sect to Bloomsbury. But Noel Lannon, who was one of my teachers, because he was a fellow of King's and subsequently provost, He said, in a way, with perhaps some exaggeration, he said, well, we were amused that you were interested in Bloomsbury. We thought of them just as our friends, and you, as if it wasn't any sort of further significance. As I say, I don't think the Bloomsbury people. They were well known and well respected writers, but at the same level as many others. And I mean, King's was very conscious that it and Trinity were because of the apostles and other reasons. That King's, and of course the other extraordinary aspect and the great experience of I did a history degree, so it was just I didn't study Bloomsbury at all. Although by coincidentally I went to a pretty much weekly at home run by Frances Cornford, who of course John Cornford's mother. But we never talked about her son. But of course, in a sense, Bloomsbury was incredibly present because E.M. Forster lived in the college, and Forster was the King's tradition. Unlike other colleges where the Dons would have lunch and dinner separately, and the King's, the Dons would at dinner would be on high table. But rather unusually, in contrast to other colleges, a fair number of the Dons, not all, for instance, Beatty Rylands never did it, but quite a few of the Dons or the affiliates who were living in college would come and have lunch with the undergraduates, and Forster would do that frequently. And it's thing again. Marielle and I have talked about this a bit. He wasn't palsy, but how can one put it? He was friendly, but not palsy. And I think the English are much more adept at what you might almost call hierarchical friendships. But he would have lunch with undergraduates, and then the tradition was at the end of the lunch, one of the undergraduates who had rooms in college would invite the group back to his room. Of course, there were no women yet. Back to his room for coffee, and Forster would come. And then when my mother came to see me take my degree, I asked Forster to come and have tea with her, and he very kindly did. And then went to talk years later. Went to talk to him about Julian. Of course, by the '60s, the greater interest in Bloomsbury. So Bloomsbury was present, but of course Noel Annan was interested. And of course, part of Noel Annan wrote the famous essay, which to an extent were particularly involved the Keynes family, the intellectual aristocracy, and the intermarriage. And Keynes, of course, Keynes was long dead, but Keynes was very much hovered over the college. So there was an awareness of Bloomsbury, but I wouldn't say, I wasn't particularly, didn't even know, how much material there would be in the archives. And I think it was subsequently, when people died and so forth, when Vanessa Bell's papers and others, I'm sorry, I know Regina's been at some of the sessions, but I guess she's not here now, and of course she tracks how she's my neighbor in the Bay Area. She tracks how the interest in Bloomsbury grew. So there was a consciousness of Bloomsbury, but it wasn't what it became. And of course now the archive is crowded with Bloomsbury scholars.
Thank you. Rachel. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating paper, lots to think about. I don't know the Adrian Stephen write-up of the Dreadnought hoax at all, but it struck me, I think you said, was it about 26 years after the event that he wrote that? And so I was just wondering if you had any sense of how those 26 years might have affected the way in which he wrote about it, in particular, given that one war had come and another one was coming by that point.
I guess I don't quite remember it, vividly enough. I mean, the pamphlet and maybe it led me to emphasize that it was a gesture against military preparedness. I don't think of Adrian. Of course, there's the biography of Adrian, which I've read years ago. I don't quite remember, and maybe others know quite what his politics were. I don't think of him as very much. He's probably on the left, but how far? But of course, I think you're right that in the sense that writing about military things after the First World War, when the war was seen as such a disaster, would emphasize its political implications. But I don't think there's any question. Horace de Vere Cole, and again, the rather amusing thing, how everything is connected in England. His sister was the wife of Neville Chamberlain, and the Chamberlains deeply disapproved of Horace's jokes, and also his wife had a child by Augustus John, but these are all sort of miscellaneous. Horace was a prankster, and I suspect my hunch would be, perhaps inaccurate, that Horace wouldn't have a political idea in his head, but Adrian might have, and as you suggest, he might well have reshaped it somewhat. But I think the main driving forces are Horace spent £500 or £600 renting the costumes, going to the costumers to having them made up. The vast expense of the whole enterprise, and for Horace it was the prank, and I think for Horace it was pretty apolitical, but it obviously had political implications. And then but I don't know, what do people make of because I haven't ventured an opinion particularly. What does one make of Virginia cross-dressing and being in blackface? I think Mark has some things about Jewishness. To what degree Virginia regarded herself as Jewish?
I'm just following Jane, who's posting from Wolf's Diary and letters.
Is this suggesting that Virginia thought of herself as being, to an extent, Jewish?
Not to me, just more that she's aware of Jews being persecuted.
Oh, yeah.
Could I ask you, Peter, what actual years were you doing the research for the Journey to the Frontier book? When were you beginning to write it?
The early 60s.
So Clive was still alive, but did you make any effort to contact him?
It's very odd, again, I think it was sort of, in a way, in retrospect, I think I should have been more aggressive. Billy and I should have been more aggressive. We were very Quentin and Olivia couldn't have been more helpful. Well, they could have been more helpful in a sense, In a sense, I think in a way they sort of controlled our work. Of course, Vanessa was alive, and for instance,
Well,
Charleston was not yet open, but they took us to see Charleston, and what's her name, the wonderful housekeeper cook,
Grace.
Grace. Grace was alive, and we met Grace, and again, we didn't pursue perhaps enough of the fellow apostles. We didn't. There was a famous photograph in the memoir group. It says a group of friends, but in fact, it's the apostles. And I think we saw Hugh Llewellyn Davis. No, what's his name? Sykes Davis. We saw some. In a way, in retrospect, I think we should have been more aggressive. On the other hand, I don't know whether Vanessa. And Vanessa never recovered. It was the greatest tragedy of our life, and I don't know what her state of health was at that point.
well, she died in 61, so she would.
Oh, she was dead. Oh, so we couldn't have. So this would have
And
been.
Clive Bell was quite ill because I'm just
Yeah.
thinking
We-
in
we-
Clive's archive there are some postcards that I think Quentin sent to Michael Holroyd saying that Clive is too ill to respond to any inquiries because Holroyd's working on his biography of Lytton also.
But Duncan. That's Clive. Yes, and somehow we met Duncan once, but we didn't really talk to him. I have, which ultimately should go to Yale. There's the splendid Duncan Grant portrait of Julian Bell, which is in the King's senior common room. But I have a sketch that once belonged to Richard Schoen that the Bloomsbury Workshop sold. I have a sketch for the portrait of Julian Bell. As I say, in retrospect, perhaps but I just have this sense, not that they said anything explicitly, but that Quentin and Olivia, who were terrific, but also in a way were shaping what we did, and we did see Lettice Ramsey. Of course, Ramsey and Musprat, the photographers, and she was in Cambridge. So perhaps we weren't quite as systematic as we should have been, or as aggressive as we should have been. But I don't know if we would have been successful. Mark, you know what being a biographer is like.
Well, yeah, I had a similar kind of diffidence because it does feel intrusive to go and, particularly with something like Death of Julian, to go and talk to people who were very close to him about that time. Might feel that you were intruding on them, but I'm sorry to go on, but your point, Peter, about how things change, it's not only the passage. Well, you talked about new things coming to light, but I think that's a good caution for all of us to recognize that the record is constantly being augmented as new discoveries are made, and particularly when you're working with people who have in their possession manuscripts and so on. There's a certain, like you said, Quentin and Olivia Bell were shaping your story, and if you develop a trust with those kinds of people, they might give you a bit more, or they might decide, no, you're not going to see this. They'll show you something, but not others. And I think generally, Quentin and Olivia Bell were very generous compared to some other literary estates.
I just very quickly should tell. It's not. Again, it was sort of. I recounted it. I think in a review in the Virginia Woolf Miscellany. But we had Angelica. Angelica was incredibly helpful, and in fact we had a wonderful lunch with her and David Garnett at the country house outside of Huntington, and there was a friend of theirs, an older friend of theirs, was there, and joining us for lunch, and she was introduced to us, Dr. Evans, I think, if I got the name right, and then after lunch we went and had coffee in a rather small drawing room, and I heard her say, "I don't understand these Americans. I don't understand how they think they can write about us." Anyway, I think biography is all a mistake. They say that Boswell's very good, but I'm not quite sure. By chance, we were going on. Quentin was then a professor at Leeds, and we were going on to stay with them, I said we met this woman. Did I know that? I think I may have known that. In fact, she was Olivia's aunt, or it emerged that she was Olivia's aunt. And it turned, I'm blanking on her name at the moment, but it turned out she was the Olivia sister whom Rupert Brooke was in love with. And in fact, Christopher Hassel begins his biography of Rupert Brooke by his attempt to get her to show Brooke's letters to her, and she wouldn't, and she was famously non-cooperative. But then, actually, again, how things change. Her granddaughter, whom I met once, is Dame Pippa Harris, who's a TV producer, and she's edited her grandmother's letters. But again, it shows that how things change and how some people don't wish to cooperate for various reasons. Did Vara what?
Unmute. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on what you said about encountering Leonard Woolf. That one?
You should have come to our panel, Vara, then you would have known.
Well, I'll very quickly say, yes, well, Billy and I went to see him to talk about Julian, and we met him in I don't know if it's still there. Chatterton Windows had its headquarters across the street from the Charing Cross station, and Leonard had this freezing tiny office off a hallway at Chatterton Windows, where he talked to us, and he's very interesting. Leonard was a severe character. I mean, he loved Julian, but I don't think he had great respect for him intellectually or as a poet, and so he was very he was very tough, and he was but very helpful. I mean, so we had a long conversation with him about Julian, which was very helpful. That was the only time we saw him. But we corresponded a lot, and of course, as I think came up in maybe in that session, a photograph was shown. I mean, Leonard was incredible. He would reuse these envelopes. The savings must have been so minute, but you would get letters from him where which had been sent to him, and then he crossed out the address and written your address. And so, but then the interesting thing that happened is we published in Journey of the Frontier for the first time excerpts from Virginia Woolf's memoir of Julian that in fact I think is published in full as an appendix to Quentin Bell's life. And as I've said, I think at the other session, the interesting thing is we wanted to quote a lot, and Lenin said, no, you may quote some, but not that much. And not because he thought it was indiscreet, but I thought again it was Lenin's attitude. Her writings are capital, and if too much is quoted, they will lose their value, but or their value will be diminished. So I think his driving was economic in a way, but also, as I said, I think it was very healthy in that I think frequently people, whatever they're writing, and maybe particularly in biographies, maybe not, over rely on quotation. And in fact, by using the block quote, I think was a term that came up in one of the sessions, and it's a way of saying, this is this tells you what we think, and it's much more of a challenge and much more imaginative and important for the authors to say what they think. And so I think quoting less rather than more is probably, so I thought it was a healthy pressure from Leonard. But he was austere and tough, but perfectly nice and very helpful. And in the preface to the little biography, short biography that Fred Leventhal, Fred also saw more of him and visited him, I think, at Monk's house. The little preface talks a bit about the meetings with Leonard.
So he sort of was educating you in terms of the use of quotations.
Yes.
Just
I
where
don't know
else?
real advice.
Just a quick question, follow up regarding your one meeting with him. What was his physique? Was he small? Tall?
No. I would say he was short to middle height. I mean, I don't know. I would say, of course, when he would have been, how old was he? 89? I think he would have been about 80. But he seemed fine. He seemed to be in good health, and he was in the process. In many ways, I think, one could discuss. I think in many ways the best thing he ever wrote were the five short volumes of memoirs, and he was in the process of writing those. Mm-hmm. And he was actually, I must say, we were deeply flattered in one of the volumes, the last or the next to last. He very sweetly said, well, two things that endear him to me. But again, it would be characteristic that he wouldn't do it directly. I remember Richard Schoen wrote something about him in the New Statesman, in which he mentioned that Leonard had thought very highly of Journey to the Frontier, and then also in one of the memoir books, he said I could, and again maybe it's his austerity. I could talk more about Julian, but it's not necessary because it's all been well said in Journey to the Frontier. So that was and it was gratuitous in the best sense. I mean, we sent him. I'm sure we sent him a copy, and he may have acknowledged it in a reused envelope. But as far as I remember, I don't remember him commenting on it. But he commented it on publicly, which of course is much better.
Indeed, for publishing purposes, absolutely.
But actually, I mean, the relationship. I think thanks to Vara, I changed something in the Leonard presentation. Clive and of course Mark may know more about this. Clive and Lytton could be very nasty and anti-Semitic about Leonard and how close. I mean, the nature of their relationship. I mean, how much maybe they didn't like each other very much, but on the other hand, they were very closely, by definition, they were very closely connected.
That's actually something that I drew from Mark's biography of Clive, because I would never have known that, the conflict between them. But thank you so much for talking about Leonard, whom we obviously know only on a page, and you actually saw him face to face.
If anybody didn't attend the Leonard Woolf panel, it would be great if you did watch the recording, because Peter did talk about this then.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking about that to this audience too, Peter.
Is there anything in the chat I should respond to?
There's a lot of things in the chat. I'm not sure. People sort of talking about Wolf's reflections on. She published a reflection on the Dreadnought hoax in 1940. So there's been a little conversation about that.
Yes, of course. She gave that talk to somebody said, was it in Rodmell or Brighton? I think it was a women's group in Brighton, but I can't quite remember.
The Rodmell talk that's the.
Was it
We're
Rodmell?
identifying it as the Rodmell talk, yeah. The platform of time. I haven't read it myself.
Yeah, Jan McVicker confirmed it. It was to the Rodmell Women's Institute, and it's published in the Platform of Time, which Jan is holding up. For those of you who have her on your screen, which is.
And the Platform of Time is sort of previously unpublished Virginia Woolf.
Yeah, that Pat Rosenbaum put
and I think it's in that that there's a commentary about Helen Suter, because Vanessa, particularly Vanessa and Quentin, I think they were in Rome at the time, and literally Julian and Helen were about to get married, and they were very upset, and they were sort of scheming with Eddie Playfair, but I don't think they actually took any steps. But I, I don't know whether they made their disapproval apparent to Julian.
I think the Dreadnought talk at Rodmell was a document that Georgia Johnson found. And he was not allowed to publish it. It went to Rosenbaum.
No, I think that was not that one. I think that was
Wasn't that one?
room. I think that was a room of one's own.
She did the Dreadnought, definitely, because she published it in the
Yeah, maybe.
Yep. So these pieces of archival materials are amazing, and they multiply, which is fascinating, because she found that, I think, in the feminist library, which had only just been hatched from a national lottery, and then Cameron shut it down. Not mistaken, but that's a different pattern of information. Wow, what a talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's also, just to pick up on what I was saying, an example of what I meant about the record constantly changing, because it's that little volume, Carlyle's House, and other pieces that David Bradshaw edited. I think that resulted from some manuscripts that were found in a drawer years that Leonard had sent to someone for typing just before he died. So then he died and the typist just sort of put it away. And then I think the story is that they were moving house and they found these Woolf manuscripts that had never been seen or published. But who knows what else might be out there.
Yeah.
Many things have been lost, as Sarah is pointing out. Wow.
Diane. I think you're still muted, Diane.
Diane? You're muted. Oh, no.
Yeah. Virginia Woolf satirized the Dreadnought hoax, sorry, in A Society. That was 1921. She treated it, here it is. The women were doing their investigation. Never have I laughed so much as I did when Rose read her notes upon honor and described how she had dressed herself as an Ethiopian prince and gone aboard one of His Majesty's ships. Discovering the hoax, the captain visited her, now disguised as a private gentleman, and demanded that honor should be satisfied. But how, she asked. How, he bellowed. With the cane, of course. So she submitted to a sort of mimic slap on the rear with a cane, and that satisfied his honor.
Public schools.
I mean, so that's 1921. So she was writing about it in a lot of different ways, fictionalizing it in that case. Worth noting.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that. Thank you. You biofictionalized it, as Sarah said.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I doubt that ever happened with the satisfying of the honor with the cane, but who knows? Perhaps it did.
Well, of course, it happened. Duncan and Cole were ceremoniously whipped.
Ah, were they?
Right.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Right after by William Fisher, but somehow they were the two. I don't know quite why. And I think Duncan's father was amused because he was having breakfast with his parents, and I think his father said, "Some friends are here to see you," and then they took him off. But I think they gave him 3 gentle. Honor was served by 3 gentle taps, something like that.
Well, that amused Virginia too. That's how it got into a society.
Ariel.
Yeah.
Also, which I talk about a bit in the book, and it's again, I love these sort of basically irrelevant coincidences. The civil servant in the Admiralty who was most involved with the incident was Graham Greene, who in fact was Graham Greene's uncle. And the reason for Graham Greene being called Graham Greene. And he wrote the memo saying, I think the best thing is to give this as little attention as possible.
Yeah, just to build upon what Diane said, I would agree with you, Peter, from our discussions, that I really do think the Dreadnought hoax was very much an elaborate public school Eton Oxbridge prank, more than anything else. And you can see the aftermath of that kind of behaviour today in our current political situation in Britain with the prankster, Joker, Prime Minister and all the parties that happen.
Do you think Boris Johnson is the latter-day Horace DeVere Cole?
Yes! Sadly, he's got more power.
Yeah. Laura, go ahead.
So I was fascinated by the, if you will, the rewriting of Julian Bell and filling in the gaps, and how, again, as a writer, was that particularly exciting, although also sort of slippery in terms of the political and, if you will, sketchiness about his relationships with women? Is it like about yourself as a writer?
No. Well, I had to, which I talk about a bit, I think, in the preface. I had to decide how to proceed, and at first I thought maybe it would be a total rewrite, but the voice of the books that Billy Abrams and I wrote together is different from either things he wrote separately or I wrote separately, and I decided the best thing was really to sort of preserve that voice. And really, I guess I had some way of putting the text of the old book online or something. And well, obviously I did some stylistic revisions, but then I just made the changes based on the considerable. I think it's almost because so much new material. Well, one could say more, but also there was so much more new material. So the book isn't quite as long as the original. I would say it's about a third, or maybe almost a half. Well, no, about a half longer than the original text. But the voice, I think, is still our joint voice rather than a separate voice, and incorporating the new material. We did again. We didn't see. I don't know because I think she was alive and in London, and again, I'm rather not ashamed, but sort of surprised that we didn't try and track down the Chinese lover, and of course when we were doing the second book, and of course some of our papers that Pat Lawrence uses are in the Berg. There's material about her in the Berg. I've forgotten how they got there, but we did talk to her daughter, who was living in London, and she had memories of Julian. She said Julian taught me how to swim, but I hated it because his idea of teaching me to swim was just to throw me in the water, sink or swim. But she said that, and her mother, of course, was dead by that time. Although I don't think she was dead when Journey to the Frontier came out. That she had known that her mother had an affair with Julian until she read Journey. But the mother, Shu Ha, is a quite highly regarded British Chinese feminist writer.
Thank you.
Ben, what does Ben say?
Yeah, Ben has written a really lovely comment. I don't know if you feel like reading aloud everything you've just written. Maybe not, Ben. Would you like me to read
do
it?
It's more a comment than really a question, but maybe that's a good place to stop. But Peter, I just wanted to express appreciation for your plenary. And it made me think of a comment made by, I think it's Vicky Macias, I'm not sure how to say her last name, in the Q&A after Gretchen's talk. She sort of raised the problem that often happens, or that we run into sometimes at Modernist Studies Conference, when the question of anti-Blackness or racism is raised. That something she's observed is that, either the white scholars freeze up, and worry about what should we or shouldn't we be studying these writers, or they try to avoid the ugly bits in favor of the beautiful bits. And I think Vicky was encouraging us to not choose either of those options, and in fact do in some sense what I think your talk does, which, as let me try to read that part because I don't want to get that wrong, which is to interrogate our relationship to and knowledge of the past, meaning how it changes, how what it means changes, how we make the past in the histories that we write and rewrite and revise, how we and the subjects we study change as time passes, and the ethical and political and aesthetic problematics that are entailed in those kinds of knowing and re-knowing. But I also wanted to say that I think it's important to ask, what do we really want to know when we're asking these kinds of questions? And I think it's worth wondering whose perspectives we value. And I think you've performed for us a rich history of how you've addressed those questions across your career. And I'm really grateful for your plenary. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. I am too. I feel the same way. It's been a real pleasure to have you here with us. And yeah, we're just very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. I might tear up.
Well, you're very well loved. You should be.
Now remember, you got to have the British sense of reserve, Peter. You're crying.
Yes. Well, thank you. We're going to have about a half-hour break, and then if people would like to attend, we'll be having an open mic where people will be reading poetry. And I've been told that people will be reading poetry in multiple languages. So it should be really fun, relaxing way to sort of end the day and socialize and enjoy a little bit of literature. Thanks so much. Thank you again, Peter.
Maybe can you send me the chat?
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a way of happy to do that. I mean, the way of doing that.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you.
And
I guess it's the dread red leave button.
oh, well, from Ukraine.
Yes, we have someone from Ukraine. It's wonderful. It's great to have you with us, Alex.
And we hope that you'll come to the salon, Peter.
He's
Yeah.
gone. He's gone. He's made an exit.
He'll be back. He will.
Let's hope. Where is he?
Okay. I'm going to try to take a short break. If
Okay,
it's all right if I end the meeting.
we're
All
leaving.
right.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.